I've been a medium for about a decade now. I've heard things that I cannot explain. I've felt things that I cannot prove. And I've delivered messages that have helped to heal people's lives, even though I didn't personally understand the message. And I still get called a demon and given the side eye. But Abraham heard a voice that told him to abandon his entire life, walk into the desert, and we made him the father of three religions. I mean, that's crap, right? I just want to know why he gets the benefit of the doubt and I don't. Welcome to Before Rome, Mediumship and God. I'm MaryAnna. This show is about allowing people to believe in mediumship without all the demon and evil crap, without the holy water and the fear. It's about understanding that the church, and the patriarchy right along with it, stole a history from us that was never theirs to take, especially from women. We have spent centuries doubting every bit of our intuition just to fit in. So let's all reclaim our God-given right to talk to spirit. His original name was Abram. According to Genesis, he was born in Ur of the Chaldeans. I'm not saying that well, I apologize. The Chaldeans, generally identified with an ancient city in southern Mesopotamia, which is modern Iraq. We're talking roughly 2000 to 1800 BC, depending on which chronology you follow. That means the pyramids had already existed, cities already existed, writing already existed, trade routes already existed. Abram wasn't a caveman wandering around with a stick. He grew up in one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth. We're going to the time he was married to Sarah, who was with him from the beginning. The Bible never gives us a job title for Abram, but we know we're going to call him Abraham. But we know he's an older man who is wealthy from his many livestock, his land, and his servants. He wasn't a peasant, of that we can be sure. Now, Abraham did not grow up Jewish because Judaism did not exist. Christianity did not exist. Islam did not exist. He grew up in Mesopotamia in a world with gods and temples, priests and dreams, omens and ancestral rituals and traditions. Abraham spent his formative years in a totally different spiritual environment than we see later in the Bible. He was from Ur, which I had to look at twice during research, thinking they were misspelling your for you are. Anyway, Ur was a bustling city of thousands. This is no backwater cave. There were markets and merchants and trade caravans, priests, all that. It was not a rural tent in the middle of nowhere. This was a time when the spiritual world was very real, when omens were a big deal, where people believed in and repeated their dreams, and where divine messages were huge. Now, Abraham was already married to Sarah when he gets the call to leave the city to go on a spiritual quest. Here's the part most people miss. Abraham didn't just wake up one morning, hear God's voice, and leave Ur. His father, Terah, had already moved the family out of the city. They were on their way to Canaan when they stopped in Haran, and I apologize for butchering these names. And that's where Abraham's story really begins. The family unit was already on the move. After settling in Haran, Abraham's father dies, and it is there that Abraham receives a call from God. We will attempt to define God in a moment. To continue the journey to Canaan. He's already in a state of transition, having left one life behind, so perhaps moving on again wasn't quite as shocking as it would have been otherwise. He leaves Ur, settles in Haran, and now he's being asked to leave once more. According to the biblical account, Abraham is in his 70s by this point, married, wealthy, as we said, and that's a lot to walk away from based on a spiritual experience. Let's take a short detour here and define the God Abraham believed at the time, or what we believe he may have believed. Since this was before Judaism, before the Torah, before Moses, before the Ten Commandments, before the temple, and before what most of us think of as a biblical religion. So who or what was God? When most people picture Abraham, they imagine a fully formed biblical religion already in place. But that is not the world that he lived in. He had no rabbi to ask if he was doing this correctly. There was just a man trying to determine whether an experience he believed came from the divine was worth reorganizing his entire life around. I would picture Abraham thinking, which God is this that wants me to pack up all my crap and walk into uncertainty and maybe even death? And this is where we leave Abraham and ask the question, well, the Bible doesn't really tell us. Biblical scholars have never pinpointed the how. So we're left guessing. Did he hear an actual voice? Did it come in a dream? Was it a vision, an angel, an overwhelming gut feeling he couldn't shake? Did something appear to him in the night that he had no language for? We don't know, and we never have. And here's what we have just accepted without question: that there was a spirit world operating in 2000 BC that spoke to people, moved through people, and changed the course of history through people. We have built religions around that belief. And we just decided somewhere along the way that it stopped working. So when Abraham believed in a divine being communicating with him, it wasn't unusual. What was unusual was which God he chose to follow. So let's get back and talk about who God actually was to Abraham, or again, what we envision this, right? Because this is where it gets interesting and a little inconvenient for the traditional story. Abraham grew up in Ur, and Ur wasn't just a city, it was a moon god city. The whole place was built around the worship of Nana, the moon god. The ziggurat, the temple, the civic identity, all of it, moon god. So right out of the gate, Abraham is not a guy we picture in Sunday school. The world he lived in had hundreds of gods. You didn't pick one and ignore the rest. You worked with whichever god covered whatever you needed. There was a god for weather, a god for fertility, a god for war, for wisdom, etc. Basically, there was just a bunch of gods waiting for a contract to get shit done. They even had household gods, little figurines kept in the home, representing family ancestors and personal protectors. And we know Abraham's family had them because later in Genesis, Rachel steals her father-in-law's household gods when she leaves. And that detail is just sitting there in the text, and most people don't consider it. So here's what the Bible doesn't tell you and what biblical scholars have been quietly arguing about for a long time. The voice that speaks to Abraham, the text calls it Yahweh. But many scholars argue about that because the name Yahweh and the whole theology that comes with Yahweh may not have existed yet in the later writers understood that. Scholars call this an anachronism. The people who wrote Genesis were writing centuries after these events happened, and they used the name they knew or wanted it to be. The name Yahweh doesn't actually get formally introduced until Moses, Exodus 3, the burning bush, where God specifically says, "This is my name." This raises an obvious question about why it's showing up in Abraham's story hundreds of years earlier. What Abraham actually heard, what he called it, what he understood it to be, we don't know. Nobody knows. He may have thought it was one of the Mesopotamian gods he already believed in. He may have had no name for it at all. He heard something, decided it was divine, and followed it. And here's where it gets really uncomfortable for the traditional narrative. The Israelites didn't start out as monotheists. The archaeological and textual evidence is pretty clear that for a long time they believed in multiple gods, and they would elevate one god above others. You don't write, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," if there are no other gods, and that commandment implies the competition existed. Some scholars have also noted that Yahweh was likely a regional deity, possibly from Edom or Midian, who got absorbed and elevated over centuries of political and religious consolidation. And the Abraham story conveniently travels from Ur, a moon god city, through Haran, also a major moon god center, before landing in Canaan. And that's not nothing. What likely happened, and I want to be clear, this is a legitimate scholarly position, not me making stuff up, is that existing spiritual experiences, Existing divine figures and existing sacred stories got rewritten, consolidated, and rebranded under one theological umbrella over the centuries, because we all know that the victor writes history. The priests would write, edit, and consolidate the Hebrew text over centuries, the Torah, the historical books, all of it. That's a long process of a priestly class controlling the narrative, deciding which stories made the cut, which gods got absorbed, and which got erased. The Dead Sea Scrolls and other archaeological finds show us there were multiple versions of these texts floating around. Someone made decisions about what became official, and that someone was the priestly class. Then the church, meaning the institutional Christian church, specifically the Catholic Church after Rome adopted Christianity in the 4th century, they took that already edited text, added the New Testament, and created canon law around all of it. What was scripture? What was heresy? The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD is the clearest example. A room full of men voted on what Christianity was. Church leaders debated and voted on matters of doctrine, authority, and orthodoxy. This is a simplification, of course. The reality is more complicated than I can fit into a podcast. Which means the church didn't introduce people to God. They repackaged what was already there, claimed exclusive rights to it, and called everything that came before it paganism. So that brings up another question. So that brings us to the question, why do we evaluate ancient spiritual experiences differently from modern ones? Most Christians accept that Abraham heard from God. Most Christians accept that prophets received messages from God. But if your neighbor told you that God spoke to him last Tuesday, you probably have questions. If Abraham showed up today and told us exactly the same story, would we believe him? I mean, let's be honest, a 75-year-old rancher's like, hey, God spoke to me, I'm selling everything, my wife and I are moving to a land that God will show us. I think we're going to give that man the side eye and be like, did he now? But we read it in the Bible or other religious testimony and we buy in. But we hear it in the wild today and we scoff. So we're applying a different standard to ancient people than we apply to the world around us now. But why? And that's what we should ask. Why do we think we are different or that they are different than any other human in history? Because before there was Judaism, before there was Christianity, before there was Islam, there was a man who believed he had heard a voice from beyond himself. And whether you call that faith, revelation, intuition, spirit communication, or something else entirely, that moment changed history. But let's keep going because I'm not sure that Abraham is the story. I think we are. For thousands of years, human beings have reported dreams, visions, voices, intuitions, visitations, signs, synchronicities, encounters with the divine, encounters with spirits, and experiences they could not explain. Abraham certainly wasn't the first. He certainly isn't going to be the last. He just happened to become famous. What strikes me as odd is that many of us will read about Abraham hearing from God and nod our heads. We'll read about Moses. We'll read about the prophets. We've built religions around them. But when someone today says they had a dream that changed their life, or that they heard the voice of God, or that they sensed the presence of a deceased loved one, or received information they couldn't explain, suddenly we act like they've grown a second head. Somewhere along the way, we decided that spiritual experiences belonged in history books only. Why have we created a category where ancient spiritual experiences are sacred and modern spiritual experiences are automatically suspect? Maybe Abraham isn't the strange one. Maybe we are. Now, I'm not here to tell you that every medium is legit. I'm not here to tell you every voice is real or every spiritual claim deserves a standing ovation. I've been in this business long enough to know that that's not true. But I am here to ask why we hand credibility to some experiences without question and snatch it away from others before they even finish their sentence. It's food for thought. Next time on Before Rome, Mediumship and God. Abraham heard a voice, but we never answered whose voice it was. Because here's the thing nobody puts in the bulletin board on Sunday morning. Who was Yahweh before the Bible tells us who Yahweh was? The God of the Bible has a history, a messy, complicated, deeply inconvenient history that includes a moon god city and a priestly class that spent centuries deciding which gods made the final cut and which ones got buried. So the next episode, let's go dig up some gods.